Hello and welcome to another episode of Team Blush. This is part 3 in the KA24ET Turbo series, and as you can see we are back in the garage today working on the block that we were working on in part 1. If you haven't seen that, go check it out. We installed our crankshaft into our block and did the Plastigauge measurements of the clearances between the block and the crank journals. Today we're going to be doing a little bit more of that on these Manley rods, but first we are going to go ahead and get our rings filed for our new forged CP Carillo pistons before going ahead and putting on these forged Manley rods onto the pistons. Then after that, once we have our pistons and rods fully assembled with our filed rings on there, we're going to install them in the block. Hopefully by the end of today and the end of the video, we can get some beauty shots for you of the CP Carillo pistons moving up and down in the cylinder bore of the block. So I think that about wraps it up for what we are looking to get accomplished today and in the video. Let's move right into a scene. We're going to be opening up this box of CP Carillo pistons and getting into our rings. Alright, so if you are not following our Instagram, this will be the first time you will get eyes on these fancy CP Carillo pistons. Inside the box, we have a spec sheet for these specific pistons and rings that were sent in this package. So that is nice to see that they include that. And then in this little blue package here, you have these snap rings that are used for the wrist pins when connecting them to our rods. Right here we have the installation specification sheet, and this has some important information right here in this little chart. This will give us the measurements that we need when filing our rings. And speaking of rings, here they are in these 4 little packages, and these are separated into cylinders. So each package has a top ring, a second ring, and the oiling rings. Move that aside. And then you get to the meat of the package, our really gorgeous looking CP pistons. These are, I believe, an 8:1 compression ratio in the single cam, the KA24ET engine. And then if you have a DE, the dual overhead cam KA24, this will be a 9:1 compression. And then finally, we have the wrist pins for connecting these pistons to our rods. And we will look at all of this again later. The only thing that we need is our installation specification sheet and our rings so that we can go ahead and get those filed. So put away this box, get our rings out, and start working on finding these measurements and get these rings filed. We will see you in a second. Alright, we have gotten our ring packages laid out on the table, and as you can see, we've gotten things organized in a manner that makes sense to us. So from the front of the engine to the back, we have 1, 2, 3, 4. These are the cylinders, and on the left side over here, we have top, second, and oil. This will associate to each ring so that we can lay them out and stay organized. On this same sheet as well, we have the clearances that we are aiming for on our ring gaps. And in order to find those clearances, as we stated before, we came to this little bit of the installation spec sheet paperwork. And as you can see, we will be working with a nitrous/turbo/supercharged installation. And to find our top ring gap, we would take the bore size of the engine in inches. You have to convert the bore size from millimeters to inches. Make sure you do that, because if you do not, this measurement will be incorrect. So take your bore size in inches times 55 thousandths, and that will give you your top ring clearance. For the second ring, just add anywhere between 4 thousandths and 8 thousandths to the size of your top ring, and that will be the size of your second ring. We went with 6 thousandths right in the middle, so we hope that will be perfectly fine. And then for your oil ring, a minimum of 15 thousandths is what you will be looking at for the clearance on that. So with that aside, we can open up one of these packages to see what is inside. So with the camera off, we went ahead and confirmed the rings are what we thought they were. This shiny ring is our top ring, and from what we understand, this is unidirectional, so it does not matter which way is up when installing these onto the piston. The much thicker ring and the more dull ring of the bunch, it almost has like a graphite or graphene finish to it. This is our secondary ring. Our third ring, hard not to distinguish from the others, is our oiling ring. And then lastly, we have these two very thin rings. These are what are known as oil rails, and these go on either side of the oiling ring. So now that we have this set up in the way that we want to organize them, let's go ahead and move to getting the gap correct on this top ring. So these come gapped from the manufacturer, but we need to double check their specs. Typically, you will have to do some filing on these rings. Sometimes you can get lucky and they will be in spec, but let's go ahead and make sure it is. So in order to install a piston ring for measuring the gap, simply push one side of the ring up against the cylinder wall to compress it, and while doing that, very, very gently push it down into the lip of the cylinder bore until it holds on just like that. With the ring compressed in the cylinder wall, we can take our new pistons or old pistons, it doesn't matter. We simply want to put it on top of our ring like that and push it down into the cylinder bore about an inch. And you want to make sure and go around the entirety to make sure that it is square in the cylinder bore. Now, with the ring properly installed into the cylinder bore and ready for us to take a measurement, we'll go back over to our piece of paper and see that the top ring requires a 19 thousandths gap. With that in mind, we can get our feeler gauge and see we have the blade for 19 thousandths. We'll simply attempt to slip this blade in between the gap right here on the piston ring, but as you can tell, we simply cannot push this feeler gauge blade into that gap, which means that we need to file it down some. So getting ready to file this top ring to the specifications that we need, and we're going to go ahead and show you some techniques that we picked up while watching some Real Street Performance videos. A lot of the knowledge that you will hear throughout this entire engine build series comes directly from them. They have a track record for really well-built engines and really fast engines, so that word is kind of the gospel for me at least. The correct orientation for a ring to be filed is to place the gap over these two pins right here, then pull it back against it for support. When filing rings, you don't want to compress these two edges into the ring filing disc. Instead, you want to simply rotate one side of the ring so that one side is being filed. You don't want to file both sides, only one side of the ring. Make sure this side of the ring is squared up as best as possible with the filing disc. And when filing, you do not want to rotate the filing disc away from the ring. You want to give the ring as much support as possible and file towards the ring as you are loading it up against the filing disc. So we'll really quickly show you what that looks like. Simply hold the ring up against the filing disc and rotate it back, putting very slight pressure on the ring itself. And now with that done, we can go ahead and take this back over to the block to square it up inside the cylinder bore and check once again with the feeler gauge if we have the correct specifications. So just like we did beforehand, we'll load it up on the side of the cylinder wall, being careful when compressing it. Only catching the lip just enough. Square it up with our new piston. And then once again, we can check with our feeler gauge whether or not that gap is correct. And it is not. We're getting close, but it's not there yet. And unfortunately, this process is very tedious. You want to take away little bits of the ring gap at a time, or else you're going to overshoot it, and then you will have to purchase a new set of piston rings. And from what I'm aware, they're not that cheap, so it's definitely a bummer if you go ahead and smoke one of these piston rings. So we're going to go ahead and do that filing process a few times. Then in a few moments, we will show you what the feeler gauge looks like and how it should fit in the gap with a correct clearance. Okay, so we've made about a dozen trips back and forth while getting this top ring right here gapped properly for this piston. But a word of caution to those of you who may be doing this and using this video as informational. I accidentally went a little too ham on this ring and gapped it about 1/1000th over on this cylinder bore. So luckily, because we know that all of these cylinder bores, even though they were brought to a machine shop, are going to be still a couple thousandths out from each other. At least there's going to be a difference in a couple thousandths between each cylinder bore. Luckily, we were able to take this to cylinder number 2, do the exact same thing, and install it in here with a little bit of persuasion and a squaring up of a piston. And as you can see, we've also taken out a bunch more blades on our feeler gauge so that now, next time we do the top ring on this first cylinder, we can sneak up on it a little bit better. So now this piston ring on cylinder number 2 are 18 thousandths if I can get the light to reflect correctly, there we go. Our 18 thousandths feeler gauge is comfortably sliding into the gap on that piston ring, but our 19 thousandths right here is not. So we are just right on the edge of having that clearance to what we want for cylinder number 2 instead of cylinder number 1, because we went about 1,000th over. That's very hard to say, 1,000ths. Anyways, yes, we went just a hair over on cylinder number 1, so we tried it in cylinder number 2, and it seems to work. Even though 1,000ths may not actually be that detrimental, it's still worth trying a different cylinder to try and get everything as right as possible. So we're going to go ahead and get cylinder number 2's top ring to its specified clearance, and then we'll get right back to you. Okay, this should be our last trip to getting the clearance on this ring. Go ahead and compress it. There we go. Try not to bind it. Square it up with our piston. Like that. And if our gap is correct, we should be at 19 thousandths. Yeah, that did slide in pretty easy though. 20 thousandths. Okay, 20 thousandths just barely wants to fit in there, so it's right there on the cusp. There's a lot of drag on the 20 thousandths, so we're right there. The spec that we were looking for with the top ring, again, is 19 thousandths with a 400 thousandths. I believe that's what that is, so a 20 thousandths on our feeler gauge is close enough, so that'll be good enough for me. Definitely a little tricky getting the absolute correct gap on these rings, but for now we'll go ahead and put this top ring on our little organizational table for top ring on cylinder number 2. Okay, and as you can see, I have laid out all my rings in the manner that I want to keep them organized. And because the second cylinder top ring is the one that we just did on accident, but it is clearance, I'm just going to go ahead and put a dot in the center of it with a Sharpie to let myself know that I am done with the gap of that ring. Now... there's quite a few more rings to do, and I'm definitely not going to keep this in the video. I may do a little bit of a time lapse, but what you just watched me do with this single ring is what I have to go and do for all of these rings. Super tedious, but of course has to get done, and it has to get done precisely, and we're just going to jump right into it. So time lapse or not, we'll see you on the other end once all of these are precisely gapped and we are ready to install them on our CP Carillo pistons. Okay, so the top rings for every cylinder have been clearanced correctly, and we're just about to move on to our secondary rings. Something to keep in mind, and the reason that we're making this quick little segment, is that these rings are supposedly a lot softer than those top rings. So because we got a little ham on the first ring that we were doing and had to move it over to this second cylinder, just wanted to reiterate that these are going to be softer, so you need to be even more careful with the secondary rings on the KA24ET application when doing the clearancing of this. So Just a little tidbit of information. Wanted to let you know so that you don't smoke these completely and end up having to buy new rings. So next step for us, get all 4 of these secondary rings gapped, and these will be gapped to a 25 thousandths of an inch. So go ahead, get right into that, and then we'll get back to you with these oil rings when we're ready to do them, because we have some questions about that, and we'll be looking up some information about that so that we can relay it to you in the next segment. Okay, so there was a bit of a jump in time between the last clip of the video and right now. As we sit, we've gotten our top rings clearanced, our secondary rings clearanced, and we stopped there because we had to go online and look up a little bit of information. As for our oiling rings and our oiling ring expanders, you can see that we are aiming for, it says minimum 15 thousandths gap, but we went ahead and put a 17 thousandths gap just to be safe. We wanted to look that up because we were not sure whether or not we had to gap these little oil expander rings, and it turns out that you do not. It's also a good thing that we looked up whether or not these needed to be gapped, because in the same time we learned about that, we learned that these oil rail rings, these apparently typically do not have to be gapped. They are so thin and are such a hard material that they are hard to gap if they need to be. And typically, if you do need to gap these rings to anything over 15 thousandths, then something is wrong, more than likely, with the machining of your block. So we're not going to mess with gapping these. We're just going to put them in the block right now, one by one, check to see if the clearance is at a minimum of 15 thousandths. And if they are, then it looks like we can begin to assemble the rings onto our pistons. So we'll go ahead really quick, check on these oil rails, and then we'll get right back with you. Now you can see by the dots on all of the oiling rail rings on the table here, we've gone ahead, checked the clearances for those, and they check out. We went back through, went through every single ring and double checked with our feeler gauge that all of our clearances are within spec. And then to finalize things, we just took this nail file and just very, very gently went over the edges that we filed down and sanded the edge off of them that was created while we were filing them. While we were doing that, we noticed on our secondary rings, and this is going to be interesting whether or not the camera will be able to pick this up or not. So let me come in close here. All right, so not sure if you can see that, but on the outer edge of the secondary ring, you can see that very fine hook. If the camera will focus, this is a very hard thing to get to focus, but there we go. That little hook on the edge of the ring, that is called a Napier hook, and it is in the documentation for the CP Carillo rods that we got. As you can see right here, Napier hook on the secondary ring, and it tells you which way is up. So beforehand, we didn't think that it mattered which direction these top and secondary rings faced when going in the cylinder, but thankfully we noticed that on filing them down, because it says right here in the documentation that if you install the second ring, which is this one, upside down, it will pump oil into the combustion chamber. So it does help to do your due diligence and go over with a file, and just make sure to be very detail oriented when putting together an engine. That was such a small thing to notice, and we're super glad that we did. Otherwise, we literally would have been taking this engine back apart in the future. Because these secondary rings on here have a stamp in for the direction that they are going to face up, we assume that these top rings, even though they do not have a Napier hook, they do not seem to have any sort of beveled edge that does need to go up. We see that this is stamped with the same in marking, if the camera will focus. There we go. So we are going to face that marking up when we are installing them onto our pistons. And with that being said, it is time to do that. So we're going to go ahead and off camera do one of these pistons on our own, just to kind of get a feel for it and see whether or not we'll be able to do it in a fluid manner for the camera. So in just a second, you'll see our rings put onto our first piston, and then we'll show you exactly how we did that. Okay, so we have the rings on our first piston here, and they went together pretty beautifully. The oiling ring expander, or the oil rail expander, whatever you want to call it. As you can tell, I'm also learning during this process, so if terms get swapped around and whatnot, I apologize, but trying to get stuff done while informing you at the same time, so it can get a little bit confusing. The oil expanding ring was probably the hardest to get on in terms of getting it on correctly. So we'll go ahead and start with that. Take our bare piston, and we'll take our oil rail expanding ring. Something to keep in mind when you are putting this onto your piston is to make sure that these two ends, you don't want them to overlap like this. You want them to butt up against each other just like that. So we'll go ahead and get this one on first. I do have an oil ring expander, but after watching Real Street Performance put these on with just their bare hands, honestly, it was easy enough for me to do with this first piston, so I would say to not even mess around with an oil ring expander. With your hands, you can feel how much tension you are actually putting on these rings and whether or not you are on the cusp of breaking them as you install them. So what I did for the oil expander ring was to just bring this edge down into the groove that this sits in, and just rotate it around the piston with your finger until it slides down into its groove. And as you can see, it is currently overlapped if the phone will focus. As you can see, it is currently overlapped right here, so you just have to push it aside until it butts up like we were talking about earlier. You can see right there, it's butting up. It's not overlapping. With the expander on, we can move to our oil rails, and same thing, we just want to bring that edge down underneath the expander in that groove, and then slowly rotate the ring around the edge of the piston, making sure that the edge of that ring is staying seated inside of that groove. And then you just simply pull it around the piston and underneath that ring. And you can see it'll sometimes get caught on the grooves as it's going down. You can just pinch it and pull it down until you seat it properly under that expander. And there we go. Sometimes it'll take a little bit of finagling, but as you can see, hopefully that lower oil rail is installed underneath the expander. Now we can go ahead and install our top oil rail. Same thing with this, we just want to get the oil rail, get the edge of it right above that oil expander and push it down into the groove, just like that. It's a little hard to do on camera, but we got it in there. And then just slowly rotate this ring around the edge of the piston. And try to keep this edge off of the piston as you bring it down onto the groove, because it will mar the piston a little bit. Not sure if that's detrimental, but definitely nice to think about when putting it on. And then this top ring should just slide right down, and there we go. So now we have our two oil rails and our oil ring expander between the two. Now we can move on to our secondary ring. There are 3 grooves in the piston, and this confused us for a second, but the middle groove here is tapered and not where we want this second ring to go. We want the second ring to go down onto the very bottom of these 3 grooves. Same thing as the oil rails. Just catch it in that groove there and be very gentle with pulling it around the piston, because this is more brittle of a rail than the others. Try and pull this edge over. See, we marred the piston just a little bit, unfortunately, but try and pull that down into that third groove, just like that, and then the ring should seat in that third groove. Once it's in, give it a little spin, make sure it is moving properly in there. Same thing with the oil rails as well. Make sure everything is moving nice and free, otherwise you may have some burrs or some other nastiness that became of the filing process or just from manufacturing in general. Finally, we have our top ring, and we will just set that into the topmost groove of the piston. Walk it around. And set it into that groove, just like that. It's pretty easy. It'd be a lot easier to do it off camera, as was that first piston. But yep, that is the rings installed on our pistons. And again, just make sure everything's moving freely. And there is a direction in which you want these gaps to sit before installing them into the block, but we'll show you that when we get to it. For now, we are just going to install these last 2 ring sets into our pistons and get ready for our connecting rods. All right, so we have got our piston ring packages put onto our pistons, and now we can go ahead and move to getting these Manley Forge connecting rods installed on them. These are an H-beam design. and are pretty tried and true from what I'm aware for turbo applications. And they come with ARP hardware already installed, so that is nice as well. Very nice looking. So we need a connecting rod. To connect it to our piston, we need a wrist pin, and then we need 2 retaining rings that also came with these CP pistons. So we'll get these out of their little bag. And then we will also use some of this engine assembly lubricant to put on this pin as we install it into the piston. Alright, so with all of our stuff laid out here, we can go ahead and install this end of the connecting rod into our piston, just like that. And we'll lay it down just for a second. Then we can go ahead and take some of this engine assembly lubricant and just apply a very small amount to this pin and get it nice and lubricated before installing it into our piston. Just like that. There should be absolutely no resistance. And then finally, install your retaining pin into the bore where that wrist pin is located. Okay, we managed to get these retainer rings installed in our piston, but not without marring up the skirt of the piston a decent amount. It's actually kind of disconcerting, but we are going to treat it with a little bit of sanding just to make sure that no burrs or any nastiness falls off in the cylinder bore as we are running the engine. That being said, it would probably be a good idea to go to a different video to learn some techniques on how to put these retainer clips in. We just watched a video after having messed up one of these sides, but even still installing with the technique that we've seen from some other YouTube videos and some engine building experts, the technique is really hard to get used to, and we still did a little bit of damage while installing the other side. So we're going to go ahead and do a time lapse on these other 3 pistons as we install the connecting rods into them. We're not going to show us putting in these retainer rings because our technique is just so bad. We do not want to glorify the work that we are doing installing those. Okay, apologies. The phone actually died while we were getting the retainer rings put into the wrist pin bores. That was a whole process. There was a lot of cursing, and really that footage is not something that I would really want to put on the channel anyways, because it was very, very frustrating. So at the end of everything, as you can see, this is the first one that we did, and we got this pretty bad mar right here next to the bore of the wrist pin. But as we moved along, a little bit of marring, and then we slowly figured out the technique. So that little bit of marring right up there is all that we had, and you can't even really feel that with your fingers. So we're a lot happier with that last one that we did. But as you can see, we now have our pistons with rings that are properly gapped installed onto our forged connecting rods. And then finally, we can go ahead and get the bearings on these connecting rods for a final Plastigauge clearance check. And then after that clearance check, we can torque down these connecting rods, and we will finally have a full rotating assembly in the block and ready for those beauty shots that we mentioned at the very start of the video. So let's go ahead and get our bearings onto our connecting rods. If you watched part 1 of this series, then you're probably going to have a little bit of deja vu in regards to installing the bearings on these rods. So we're not going to get too detailed on this, but we will still show you the process. These rod caps are held in with some little locating pins, so they can be a bit of a pain to actually get off of the rod. So just give them a wiggle. There we go. Just give them a wiggle when you are taking them off, and you can see those little locating nubbins or pins or whatever you want to call them. Just like when installing the main bearings in the block in part 1, you can see right here and right here these little indentations in the rod where the bearings are set. Go ahead, get our bearings out of the box. Get these open. And there we have it, 2 bearings for our rod. This will just simply click into place, just like we did on the main bearings. Just like that. Then likewise with the cap, just find your indentation on it right there and install your other bearing. Try to make sure that it sits as flush as possible with each lip, but that really doesn't matter because as you bolt down both sides of this to each other, it will self-locate inside of the groove of the rod. But it's best to have it as centered as possible just to make sure it doesn't do any weird binding when you are bolting them together. So it really is as easy as that. Again, if you've seen part 1 of this build series, you've seen bearings installed. So we've already gotten them installed on our first piston. We'll go ahead and get them on these last 3, and then we'll see you in just a second. So we have gone ahead and gotten the last of the bearings installed into our rods and our rod caps. As required by the Manley performance documentation, we needed to soak the ARP hardware that came with this rod set in some 30 weight oil. So that's what is in that container right there. We have our hardware and some 30 weight oil in that container. Because we will only be potentially installing these pistons into our block a single time if the clearances on these caps check out, we need to think about setting the end gap placement on our pistons. And if we go over to this documentation that came with these CP pistons, we can find this diagram to show how to do that. You can see that in reference to this being the front of the engine, that we need to have our oil rails at about a 45-degree offset of each other. The oil ring expander will be at the very bottom of our piston. And then the top and second compression rings will be 180 out from each other. So we'll go ahead, we'll get our first piston over here so that we can show you how to orient those. Okay, so let's go ahead and get the end gap placements done on this first piston. We're going to go ahead and say that the side of the rod with our logo is going to be engine front. So we'll just rotate the piston like that. So we're going to go ahead and do our oil rail bottom gap orientation first. And in reference to us having engine front over here and considering straight up would be about 12 o'clock, we'll say that oil rail bottom is about 2 o'clock in our positioning. So right here, whether or not you can see that gap is another thing, but trust it. Yeah, there it is. That gap right here, we'll need to rotate that around to about maybe a little more, probably about right there. So our oil rail gap is right here, just like on our diagram. Now let's move on to the oil ring expander gap. That will be at directly 6 o'clock in line with our rod. So we need to go ahead and find the gap where it butts up together on the piston. That is easier said than done. But if we look real hard, all right, here it is. So this is where this pick comes in, making sure to hold the backside of these rings. You can go ahead and grab that expander and rotate it, hopefully without rotating the oil rails above and below it. And we need to orient that gap of this expander all the way down to 6 o'clock. And there we go. Again, not sure if you can see it, but you'll have to trust us. Right here is the gap, or where the two ends butt up together on the oil ring expander. We're going to go ahead and just make sure that this bottom rail didn't rotate at all while we were moving that oil ring expander, which it did. So we will have to reorient that bottom rail, and then we'll move on to the top rail. And once we get those two, or rather, once we get all three of these in their correct orientations, we'll go ahead and do the second compression ring and the first compression ring. Okay, I apologize for not showing that on camera, but that is the definition of a Sisyphean task. So as you can hopefully see, right here we have our oil ring expander. The two ends that butt up together are in line with the bottom of our piston in reference to this diagram. If we rotate the piston right here, again, whether or not you can see, we have our oil rail on the bottom is gapped at about a 2 o'clock position. And then if we continue rotating, we can see the gap for the top oil rail ring is at about the 11 o'clock position. So the last two that we need to do are much easier than those three, but for our second compression ring gap, that needs to be facing the front of the engine, so it needs to be in line with the logo on our rod. Take that gap and bring it all the way around until right there at about the 9 o'clock position. Then for our top compression ring, we'll completely 180 that out in reference to our secondary compression ring, and that will go at about a 3 o'clock orientation. So that is the end gap placement for our piston. Now we are ready to go ahead and install this into the block. And be careful as you are trying to install this. Make sure that your ring gaps don't move around as much as possible while installing them into the block. So we'll grab our piston ring compressing tool and we'll meet you over by the block. Okay, so getting ready to install our first piston here into cylinder number 1 of our engine. Finally get to unbox and show off this really fancy tool that I've been kind of excited to use. It's really simple, but it is still pretty cool in the way that it operates. So this is a Wiseco tapered ring compressor for when installing pistons. Typically you'll have a cheaper tool that kind of wraps around the rings on your piston in order to compress these down to the point that you can slip them down into the cylinder bore of your engine. With those, it's very easy to not have it square on the deck of the block as you are pushing your pistons down into the cylinder. When that occurs, there is potential for one of the rings to slip out between the crevice of your tool and the deck of the block, and if you're pushing down hard enough, you will actually break that ring. And then after having gone through this entire process, you will have to pull that off and redo it all over again. So these tools are a little bit more expensive than your typical cheaper ring compressor, and these only work for the specific bore that you are working with instead of the more universal design of those cheaper tools. But I believe this to be well worth it so that we don't smoke one of those rings as we are pushing it down into this cylinder bore. So really simply, just place this on top of the deck of your block, and this has a tapered inner sleeve so that as you push the piston down through it, it will clamp around those rings and help it not snap them as you install your piston. So we also went ahead prior to starting this recording and lined the entirety of the cylinder bore with oil. And it's really easy. Just place your piston on top of that tool, and as you slide it down, it will easily just compress those rings. As we said, push it down very gently. Make sure your tool is flush with the deck. Look from underneath and make sure that your connecting rod is squared with the crankshaft journal as you push it down. And then in one smooth motion, you should be able to slip it right in. So as you could hear in the little bit of startle in our voice, it kind of slipped right in, but we're still good. It did not make any contact with our crankshaft, and we can further push it down until it meets up with that. While we were pressing this piston down the cylinder wall, on the underside, we just kept watching to make sure that it was in line with the crankshaft journal. So we're going to go ahead and get the engine flipped around so that you can see where we are going to bolt in the cap to our connecting rod. Okay, so here we have the back side of our crankshaft where our connecting rod is pressed up against. And as you can see, we'll simply take our connecting rod cap and we will place it down just like we did with the caps for the main bearings. We'll go ahead and tighten this down once we get some Plastigauge on this surface, and we'll see if this bearing is in spec. Okay, so as you can see, we've gone ahead and gotten some Plastigauge on that bearing surface. We'll go ahead and we will retrieve 2 of these ARP bolts from their little oil bath. And then we can go ahead and install the cap onto our connecting rod. The final specs that these bolts need to be torqued down to is 65 foot-pounds. My torque wrench only does a minimum of 50 foot-pounds, so we were going to do 30 foot-pounds first on these bolts, but instead we are simply going to run them down with our fingers until we can no longer turn them, and then from there we'll go ahead and torque them down to 50 foot-pounds, 60 foot-pounds, and then a final 65 foot-pounds. And we'll go ahead and take these bolts off, take a look at that Plastigauge, and if the clearances are correct, then we're just going to bolt these caps back down after putting some engine lubricant on both sides of these bearings and move on to our other 3 pistons. Okay, so we've gotten those tightened to 65 foot-pounds. We're going to go ahead and loosen these off. And sorry for the quick cut there, but we had to fight to get this cap off of the connecting rod. So as you can see, there are our Plastigauge marks. Okay, so in reference to the clearance that we are looking for from our Plastigauge guide, if we come back into our manual and look at the connecting rod oil clearance for the 1989 KA24E, right here we can see that anywhere between 400 thousandths and 14 thousandths is a good spec. On our Plastigauge guide, the closest spec and the lowest spec that we can get is 1 thousandths. So if we bring that up to our mark, we can see that it is a little thicker than that 1 thousandths and even more thicker than that 15 thousandths. So with that in mind, it is safe to say that this is anywhere between those clearances that we see in the manual. So we should be good to go on those clearances. So finally, we are going to drop the piston out of the engine. We're going to get all of these bearing surfaces as clean as we possibly can, along with our connecting rod cap. And we'll go again and we will install the piston for one final time, making sure again that the gaps on the rings are in the correct orientation. And then we can finally get this first piston bolted down for the last time in the block. And with that little montage done, we have our first cylinder installed in our block. We'll have to do it 3 more times, but for now, we're going to do a little rotation of the crank and see if it feels weird at all, see if we're feeling any binding in the rotating assembly while we do it. Everything feels good right now. Going back down. And we are at the bottom stroke of the cylinder, and here it comes right back up. There we go. So I think that's going to wrap it up for this video. Here at the end, of course, we'll do the beauty shots that we've been promising this entire video. But just wanted to say thanks a lot for tuning in to part 3 of the build series. We hope to get part 4 out here pretty soon. There's still quite a lot to do on the S13 in order to get this engine installed. If you haven't already, consider following our Instagram at team.blush, where we've already showed off a lot of the parts that are going to be getting installed in the S13 that you will see further throughout this build series. But if you want little sneak peeks and other fun stuff, definitely think about going over there to Instagram. And with that being said, we hope to see you in part 4 of the build series. Have a nice day or night, whatever it is for you, and take it easy.